want to welcome you to Thrive in the Word. I was thinking the other day that when I was in Bible college, I took a course in exegesis. Now, exegesis is basically the way, or one of the ways, that you can interpret the scriptures. There's the other way is eisegesis. Eisegesis means that you read things into the scripture and then cause the scripture to form around it. Exegesis is you read the scripture and then form your thoughts from it. And that's, by the way, is the best way of interpreting the scripture. But my professor at the beginning of the term said, he said, now for your term project, he said, you're going to have to exegete or dissect a whole chapter of the Bible, of the New Testament. And he said, but I want to warn you. He said, do not try to do First Peter. And so I didn't do First Peter. I think I did the second chapter of the book of Ephesians. But First Peter is very, very difficult to understand. Now, that doesn't mean we can't understand. But what you really need to do is you need to stay focused on the purpose and the historical background of the book in order to really understand what Peter is talking about. Now, today we're in 1 Peter, the 4th chapter, verse number 1. And this is what he says, therefore, since Christ has suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same purpose, because he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. Now, notice that the very first word that Peter writes here is he says, therefore. Now, normally when you hear the word therefore, you back up and you find out what the theme, what's been talked about. And what we see here is that Peter has been talking about Jesus and what Jesus did, but he ends chapter number 3 by telling us that Jesus is seated in heaven, and he's seated over authorities, powers, and that those authorities and powers are subject to him. And so we need to understand that because of where Jesus is seated, because he rules and reigns over these authorities and powers, therefore, what? Therefore, and then he says, since Christ has suffered in the flesh, in other words, because Jesus went to the cross and he suffered in the flesh, so he says, therefore, since Christ has suffered in the flesh, and this is what he says to us now, arm yourselves. Arm yourselves. You know, this word arm in the Greek language actually means to equip yourself like you're going to war. You see, we need to understand that we as Christians need to have this mentality. In fact, really what Peter is talking about is our intentions or our mentality as believers. We need to have this mentality that we are armed, that we are ready for war, that we are ready to go and resist every evil spirit that's out there in the world. Now, Peter's not talking about resisting people. He's talking about resisting darkness. That's why he tells us in the end of chapter 3 that Jesus is ruling over all these authorities and powers. So he's telling us that we as believers, we need to have this attitude on the inside of us, that we are arming ourselves, that we are preparing ourselves, that we are prepared. Now notice what he says next. Arm yourselves also with the same purpose. What is the purpose? Now some people would say, well, the purpose is that we suffer. That's not what the purpose is. The purpose is that we rule over principalities and powers, that we rule over our natural flesh, that we rule over the things that would cause us to sin. Now notice what Peter says next. He says this, because he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. Now, I've been to Mexico many, many times. And there's a place in Mexico where people will actually crawl over broken glass. And one of the reasons why they do that is because they say that we are suffering in the flesh. Now, let me say this to you. Suffering does not rid you from sin. That is not what this is talking about. What he's talking about is this intention, this thought, this motive. You see, Jesus came to earth, and he came to earth and he suffered. Now, he didn't suffer just for the sake of suffering. He suffered so that we could be free. He suffered so that he could rule and reign, so that he could take back the keys from the kingdom of darkness and say, no more, it's finished. I've got the keys of life and death. You see, Jesus' intention was to come to this earth and to suffer, but not to suffer to die, not just to suffer for the sake of suffering. There's places in the Philippines where around Easter time, men will have themselves crucified. And they think that through that they're going to reign over sin. No. Jesus already has put to death sin. We are already free from sin, but we need this attitude or this intention on the inside of us that we are going to resist evil till the day we die. I heard the wonderful Mario Murillo many, many years ago say this. He said, I'm going to go up in the rapture, but I'm going to go up feet first. And he said, I'm going to be punching the lights out of the devil all the way up. Well, you see, Jesus came to suffer, but he came to suffer so that he could redeem man. Now, Peter is saying the same thing. We need to come and look at the suffering that's caused by persecution, and basically that's the suffering that's being talked about here. But we need to see it as something that we do in order to resist sin, in order to resist evil in our lives and in the lives of other people. Now, I hope that you enjoyed this podcast. And I hope that you continue to listen as we're going even deeper into this in our next podcast. Now, if you would, we would just really love it if you would just hit that subscribe button, and that you would hit that little thumbs up button and just tell the YouTube people that you really appreciate this. It would help us a whole lot. Now, until we speak to you again, may God bless you richly.